The restaurant was the kind of place where the menus had no prices. Not because the food was free, but because if you had to ask, you probably shouldn't be there. My girlfriend Amara had picked it. She wanted everything to be perfect. She had spent 2 hours getting ready, changed her dress 3 times, and asked me at least 4 times if her father would like me. I told her the truth each time. I said I didn't know. But I wasn't worried. I had learned a long time ago that the only opinion that truly matters in a room is the one backed by real power. And real power, I had also learned, never announces itself at the door. I straightened my jacket, checked the time on my simple steel watch, and followed Amara inside. The hostess smiled warmly and led us to a private table near the back. White tablecloths, soft lighting, the smell of money and good wine floating in the air. I pulled out Amara's chair before sitting down. Then I looked up and saw him walking toward us. His name was Mr. Harlan Osei. He was a big man, not just in size but in the way he carried himself. He walked like someone who expected the room to notice him. His suit was dark and expensive. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. He had the kind of face that didn't smile easily, with sharp eyes that measured everything quickly. Beside him was Amara's mother, Mrs. Osei, a quiet, elegant woman who looked like she spent most of her life trying to soften the edges of her husband's personality. I stood up the moment they reached the table. It is what you do. It is what you were raised to do. My mother taught me that standing when an elder enters a room costs you nothing, but says everything about who you are. Understood. I extended my hand across the table toward Mr. Osei. He looked at it. He looked at me, at my plain watch, my modest jacket, my calm face. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down. Without a word. Without a glance. As if my outstretched hand simply did not exist. The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. But it felt much longer. Amara made a small sound, something between a gasp and a swallow. Her mother looked at the tablecloth. A waiter nearby pretended to be very busy with a wine list. I lowered my hand slowly. I did not clench it. I did not flush with anger. I simply sat back down and picked up the menu. Mr. Osei adjusted his napkin, cleared his throat and said, "I don't shake hands with men who can't take care of my daughter." His voice was even, almost bored, like he was stating a fact about the weather. Amara's hand found mine under the table. She squeezed hard. I could feel the embarrassment radiating off her like heat. I looked at Mr. Osei over the top of my menu. I gave him a small nod. Nothing more. I did not argue. I did not explain myself. Some men, when they feel disrespected, get loud. They want the whole room to know they've been wronged. I am not one of those men. I have always believed that the best response to underestimation is patience. And timing. We ordered. The conversation that followed was polite on the surface, but there were sharp edges underneath every sentence. Mr. Osei asked about my work. I gave him a simple answer. I told him I managed investments. He asked where my office was. I named a street. Not the building, just the street. He asked what kind of car I drove. I told him it was a gray sedan. He smiled at that, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. It's more like a quiet verdict. He had already decided what I was. In his mind, I was a young man with a vague job, a modest watch, and a gray car, sitting across from a man who ran his own company and had built something real. I could feel him categorizing me, filing me away under not good enough. And I let him. 'Cause here is the thing about people who judge quickly, they stop watching. They think they already know the answer, so they stop asking questions. That is when they become dangerous to themselves. Mr. Osei ordered a second glass of wine and began to talk about his company. This happened naturally, the way confident men always steer conversations back to their greatest achievement. His company was called Osei Industrial Supplies. It sourced and distributed raw materials to mid-sized manufacturers across the region. He had built it over 20 years, starting with a small warehouse and 2 delivery trucks. Now he had a fleet, 3 depots, and over 200 employees. He spoke about it the way a man speaks about a favorite child, With pride, with detail, with love. He mentioned that the company was in the middle of securing a major government supply contract. It was worth a lot of money. Enough to expand operations, hire more staff, and open a fourth depot in the north. He said it confidently. Not boasting exactly. More like a man laying his achievements on the table and daring you to match them. I listened carefully. I nodded when appropriate. I asked one or two polite questions. And somewhere between his description of the contract and his second glass of wine, something clicked inside my head. I recognized the company name. I knew Osei Industrial Supplies. Not personally, not yet. But I knew it the way you know a face you've seen somewhere before but can't immediately place. Came to me slowly like a photograph developing. Our holding group, a quiet collection of companies and investments that my family had built over 3 generations, had indirect connections to his world. We didn't advertise this. That was the point. My grandfather had taught my father, and my father had taught me. The loudest person in the room is rarely the most powerful. We held stakes in companies through layers of ownership. We sat on boards quietly. We made decisions that moved markets without ever appearing in the news. By the time the dessert menus arrived, I had placed the connection. And what I found, turning it over in my mind, was not pleasant. Not for Mr. Osei anyway. Dinner ended with handshakes all around, except of course one. Mr. Osei shook the waiter's hand. He shook his wife's friend's hand when she stopped by the table. He did not shake mine on the way out either. He gave me a brief nod, the kind you give a parking attendant, and walked ahead with Amara's mother. Amara held my arm tightly as we walked to the car. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm so sorry. He does this with everyone he doesn't think is worthy. It's not just you." I told her it was fine. She didn't believe me. She thought I was hurt. I wasn't. I was thinking. I was running numbers in my head, tracing connections, following chains of ownership like threads through a darkroom. By the time I dropped Amara home and drove back to my apartment, I had a clear picture forming. I sat in my car for a few minutes in the underground parking lot, engine off, thinking. Then I went upstairs, made myself a cup of tea, and made 3 phone calls. The first call was to a man named Kweku. He managed operations for one of our supply chain subsidiaries, a company called Bridgepoint Materials. Bridgepoint was, among other things, the primary supplier of raw materials to companies like Osei Industrial Supplies. I didn't call Kweku to tell him to do anything. I called him to ask questions. I asked him about Osei Industrial's account. He told me what I needed to know. The account had been extended generous credit terms for years, longer payment windows than most clients received. This had been done quietly, as a courtesy, because someone in our network had once vouched for Harlan Osei as a good businessman. That voucher had never been formally reviewed. No one had ever checked if the courtesy was still warranted. I told Kweku to pull the full account file and send it to me in the morning. He said he would. I hung up and made the second call. The second call was to a woman named Dr. Abina Tawia. She was the chair of a procurement review board, a government-adjacent body that evaluated large supply contracts before final approval. I had been sitting on their advisory panel for 2 years. It was unpaid, quiet work, the kind that builds real influence without creating noise. I didn't call Dr. Tawia to interfere with anything. I called because I remembered that Osei Industrial's big contract was currently in the review phase. I asked her, carefully and professionally, whether compliance documentation had been fully submitted. She paused. She said there were some outstanding items. Standard practice required they be resolved before the contract could move forward. I thanked her and told her I would see her at next month's panel meeting. Hung up. Then I made the third call, the shortest one. I called the analyst at our family's private office and asked him to pull the credit file on Osei Industrial Supplies from a regional lender we had a relationship with. He called back in 40 minutes. What he told me was not surprising. But it was serious. Osei Industrial Supplies was carrying more debt than it showed on the surface. The company had borrowed heavily over the past 3 years, expanding too fast, betting on contracts that had been delayed. The big government contract Mr. Osei had boasted about at dinner was not a sure thing. It was a lifeline. Without it, the company's cash flow would tighten dangerously within the next quarter. The only reason things had stayed stable this long was a combination of extended credit from Bridgepoint Materials and a revolving credit facility from a mid-tier regional lender. Both of these had been treated as permanent arrangements. They were not. Credit is never permanent. It is always a relationship, and like all relationships, it requires trust, history, and the belief that the other party is managing their risk responsibly. I closed my laptop at midnight and went to bed. I had not made a single call asking anyone to hurt Harlan Osei. I had only asked questions. But sometimes the right questions, asked at the right time, are enough to start a process that moves entirely on its own. The next morning I received the Bridgepoint account file. I reviewed it with Kweku over a video call. What it showed was that Osei Industrial had been operating on 60-day credit terms while most clients were on 30. The reason this had never been flagged was simple. No one had looked. In large organizations, legacy arrangements get buried under years of routine. Kweku asked me what I wanted to do. I told him to apply standard terms to all accounts. No exceptions, no special arrangements, unless each one had been reviewed and formally approved in the past 12 months. This was not a punishment. This was good business practice. It was the kind of thing any competent board member would recommend after a routine audit. Kweku said he understood and would have the letters sent by end of day. Changing credit terms on an existing account requires 30 days written notice. It is completely standard. It is completely legal. For Osei Industrial, already stretched thin, it would mean a sudden and significant tightening of available cash. By mid-morning, the second thread began to move on its own. Dr. Tawia's office sent a formal query to Osei Industrial's compliance team. It was a routine follow-up, the kind that gets sent dozens of times every month during contract reviews. It asked for 3 outstanding documents: an updated insurance certificate, a signed declaration of financial standing, and a third-party audit report that had been requested 6 weeks ago but never received. These were not unusual requirements. They were standard. But for a company already under financial strain, producing a credible audit report in a short window would be difficult. Amara called me that afternoon. She sounded worried. She said her father had come home early from work. She said he was in a bad mood, pacing, making phone calls, shutting himself in his office. She didn't know why. I listened carefully. I said I hoped everything was okay. I meant it, in a way. I did not want Amara's father to suffer. I wanted him to understand something. Those are very different things. By early evening of the first day, the news had already begun to travel through the business community the way bad news always does. Fast and quiet, in corners and corridors, over phone calls that begin with, "Have you heard about Osei Industrial?" Supplier had tightened terms. A major contract was under review. Rumors grow from small facts in business circles. People who had been planning to extend Osei Industrial further credit suddenly found reasons to pause and wait. This is how real financial pressure works. Not one big explosion, but many small doors closing at the same time. Each one is reasonable. Each one is justified. Together they add up to a wall. Mr. Osei spent the evening on the phone. I know this because Amara told me the next morning. She said her mother had barely slept. Her father had been on calls until 2 in the morning, his voice alternating between controlled and strained. She asked me if I had heard anything through my work contacts. I told her I had heard nothing specific. That was technically true. I had not heard. I had seen. Day 2 began with the credit facility. The regional lender that held Osei Industrial's revolving credit line conducted a routine risk review every quarter. The previous review had been lenient. A relationship had smoothed things over. But our family office had a quiet stake in a fund that held a minority position in that same lender. It was not controlling. We could not direct decisions. But we had requested a copy of the latest risk review report as part of our standard portfolio monitoring. When the analyst presented it to the lender's risk committee that morning, the numbers were hard to argue with. Osei Industrial's debt ratio had increased. Their largest incoming contract was flagged as uncertain. Their primary supplier had just changed payment terms. The committee voted to suspend the revolving credit facility pending a full financial review. Again standard. Again legal. Again. Devastating for a company running on borrowed time. By noon, Harlan Osei knew that 3 pillars were shaking at the same time. And he did not yet understand why. The calls he made that afternoon were frantic. He called his bank relationship manager. He called the procurement board's main office. He called Bridgepoint Materials and demanded to speak to someone in authority. At each of these places, he was told the same thing in different ways. This is routine. This is process. We understand your frustration, but these are standard procedures. There was no villain he could point to. No face attached to the pressure. Just systems doing what systems are supposed to do when the numbers don't look right. I was in a meeting when my phone buzzed. It was a message from someone I knew at Bridgepoint, just a few words. Someone named Osei has been calling all morning. 3rd time this hour. He's asking for the name of whoever flagged his account. I put my phone face down and returned to my meeting. The trap a proud man always falls into is this. When things go wrong, he looks for someone to blame. He looks outward. He rarely looks at his own decisions, his own overreach, his own arrogance. Harlan Osei was looking for a name. He was about to find one. It was late afternoon on the 2nd day when a contact at the procurement board mentioned my name in passing. Not dramatically. Not as a warning. Just in the way business people talk. You know, the advisory panel and Kofi Asante sits on it, so the review process is quite thorough these days. Kofi Asante. Name. Mr. Osei heard it from someone who heard it from someone else. He asked the person what they knew about me. The person said, "He's quiet, but he has a lot of reach. His family runs Asante Holdings." Asante Holdings. A holding company with interests in materials supply, financial services, real estate, and several other sectors. Not well known publicly. Very well known in business circles. The person told Mr. Osei one more thing. They told him that Asante Holdings had a stake in Bridgepoint Materials. Mr. Osei went very quiet on the phone. He asked one more question. Does Kofi Asante have a girlfriend named Amara? The person didn't know. But by that evening, Mr. Osei had made the connection all by himself. Amara called me at 7 in the evening. Her voice was strange. Tight, careful, like she was trying to say something without saying it. She told me her father had asked about me. Not the casual questions from dinner. Real questions. Business questions. She said he had spent 2 hours online on the phone making inquiries. She said he had gone pale at some point during the afternoon and hadn't spoken much since. She asked me directly, "Kofi, did something happen between your work and my father's company?" Pause. I told her the truth, that I had not done anything improper. That every action taken had been routine, standard, and professionally justified. She asked if I had done anything at all. Said yes. I told her I had asked questions and reviewed information that was relevant to connections in my network. I told her that what I found had led to standard business processes being applied correctly. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He's going to want to meet you." I said I expected so. I told her to tell him I would be at my office the following morning. I arrived at my office at 8:30 the next morning. It was a modest space on the 14th floor of a building most people walked past without a second look. No sign with my name on it. No reception desk with a logo behind it. Just a clean room with a long table, good chairs, and a view of the city below. My assistant told me that Mr. Osei had arrived at 8 o'clock and had been waiting in the lobby for 30 minutes. I told her to bring him up. I stood near the window and looked at the city while I waited. I was not nervous. I was not angry. I had slept well. I had made my decisions carefully, and I knew each one was sound. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from knowing your hands are clean. I heard the door open. I turned around. Harlan Osei walked into my office. He was the same large man I had met at dinner. Same strong jaw, same sharp eyes. But something had shifted. The weight of the last 48 hours was visible in the lines around his mouth, the slight looseness in his posture. He looked like a man who had been running and had just realized the ground ahead was uncertain. He stopped a few steps inside the door. He looked around the room, at the clean table, the city view, the quiet confidence of the space. I watched him recalculate. You could see it happening in real time. The mental image he had built of me, the modest young man with the gray sedan and the plain watch, was being taken apart and rebuilt with new information. I said good morning. I gestured toward the chairs at the table. He moved slowly toward one. And then, before he sat down, he did something I had not fully expected, even though some part of me had known it was coming. He stopped. He turned to face me. And he extended his hand. Not casually. Not the way you shake hands with someone at a party. He extended it with his full body turned toward me, standing straight, looking me in the eye. The way you extend a hand to someone you respect. Or someone you fear. Or both. I looked at his hand. Not for a long time, just a second or two. I thought about the restaurant. I thought about Amara squeezing my hand under the table. I thought about her voice on the phone, tight with embarrassment. I thought about what it means to refuse a handshake. Not the social gesture itself, but what it communicates. Says, you are beneath me. It says, I have decided who you are before you have had the chance to show me. I thought about all of this in the space of 2 seconds. Then I reached out and shook his hand. Firmly, warmly, the way my father taught me. And I said the words that had been sitting quietly at the back of my mind since that dinner. I don't refuse handshakes. I just remember who does. He held my grip for a moment longer than expected. Then he sat down. And for the first time since I had met Harlan Osei, the room felt equal. Neither of us was performing. Neither of us was pretending. We were just 2 men at a table, at the beginning of an honest conversation. He did not come to beg. I want to be clear about that. He was too proud to beg, and honestly, I respected him more for it. He came to understand. He asked me, directly and without drama, whether I had acted deliberately. I told him the same thing I had told Amara, that every action was standard and justified, but that yes, I had asked questions that triggered those actions. He nodded slowly. He asked why. I told him the truth. Because when I heard about his company at dinner, I recognized connections to my network that needed to be reviewed. I told him the review had revealed real issues. Overextension, missing compliance documents, credit terms that should have been normalized long ago. I told him that none of what happened was manufactured. It was all real. He sat with that for a while. Then he said something I did not expect. He said, if you had told me at dinner who you were, none of this would have happened. I leaned back and said, if you had shaken my hand at dinner, I might never have looked. We talked for over an hour. Not about deals or contracts or credit terms. About something more important. He told me about building his company, the early years, the setbacks, the sacrifices. He was not a bad man. He was a proud man who had learned in a hard world that showing weakness cost you everything. He had grown up in a time and a place where how you looked, what you wore, and who your family was determined how people treated you. So he had learned to read people by surface signals. Modest watch. Gray car. Vague answers about work. To him, those were signals of failure. He had been wrong. I told him that I understood where his thinking came from. I also told him that it had nearly destroyed his company. Not because of me, but because while he was focused on judging people, he had stopped paying attention to the cracks forming underneath his own feet. The overextension. The missing documents. The borrowed time. Those were his choices. I had not created them. I had simply stopped quietly covering for them. Before he left, I made one thing clear. I was not interested in ruining him. I was not interested in a revenge story or a power display. I was interested in respect. Not for myself specifically, but as a principle. I told him that the people who work for him deserve a boss who treats others the way he would want his own employees treated in a room full of strangers. I told him I would not stand in the way of his company recovering. The credit terms were now standard, the same as everyone else's, fair and clear. The contract review would proceed normally. If his compliance documents were in order, the contract could still go through. The lender would complete their review. If the numbers held up, the facility could be restored. None of this was a gift from me. It was simply business operating correctly. What he did with that was up to him. He stood to leave. The door, he paused. Without turning around, he said, "You would have been a good son-in-law from the start if I had been paying attention." Then he walked out. Amara came to my apartment that evening. She had heard from her father. She sat on my sofa with her knees pulled to her chest and looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Part relief, part something more complicated. She said, "He told me you were the most dangerous kind of person he had ever met, someone who doesn't need to prove anything." I asked her if she was angry with me. She thought about it for a long time. Then she said no. She said she was angry with the situation, with the fact that her father's pride had brought him to the edge of losing everything, and that it had taken something this serious to make him see clearly. She said she was also, quietly, a little proud of me. Not for the business side of it. For the handshake. For the fact that when he extended his hand at my office door, I took it without hesitation. She said that was the moment when she heard about it that she knew who I really was. I told her that forgiving someone doesn't mean forgetting what they did. It means deciding that who they could become matters more than who they were. 3 months later, Osei Industrial Supplies was still standing. The compliance documents had been submitted. The contract had gone through. Smaller than originally planned, but real and solid. The credit facility had been reviewed and partially restored, with cleaner terms and better oversight. Mr. Osei had hired a proper financial director, someone with the skills to catch the things he had been missing. We were not close, Harlan Osei and I. We were not yet friends. But when I walked into a room where he was standing, he stood up. And when I extended my hand, he took it immediately. Both hands, firmly, with eye contact. Amara noticed it the first time it happened. She reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, just like she had at that first dinner. But this time she wasn't apologizing for anything. The watch on my wrist was still the same plain steel one I had worn that first night. I had not changed it. I never planned to. Real power, the kind my grandfather had spent a lifetime building, has nothing to do with what you wear. It has everything to do with what you know, what you own, and most of all, who you choose to be when someone in the room decides you are not worth their hand.